Imagine walking into a bustling zoo in New York City in 1906. The air filled with the chatter of excited visitors and the scent of animals from every corner of the globe. You wander past lions and elephants, past cages of exotic birds and primates, when suddenly, your eyes fall upon a man. Not just any man, he is standing behind bars, staring out at the crowd with a mixture of fear, confusion, and quiet dignity. Next to it, an orangutan swings lazily on a branch, drawing laughter and fascination from the visitors. Above his cage hangs a sign reading "Missing Link," a cruel suggestion that this human being is somehow less than human. A spectacle meant to entertain and reinforce false ideas of racial hierarchy. This man is Ota Benga, a Congolese from the Beauty people, whose life would become one of the most tragic examples of exploitation and injustice in history. Ota Benga was only one of thousands of people forcibly removed from their homes during the era of human zoos, a time when non-European peoples were displayed for profit, curiosity, and the misguided belief in racial superiority. At just 23 years old, he had already survived unimaginable loss: his family killed, his homeland devastated by colonial violence, and his freedom stolen. And yet, despite all he endured, Benga remained strikingly resilient, navigating a world that refused to see him as fully human. In this video, we will explore the life of Ota Benga, tracing his journey from the forests of the Congo to the heart of New York City, and examining the broader context of human zoos in the 19th and 20th centuries. We will uncover how pseudoscience, greed, and ignorance combined to dehumanize countless people. And we will also honor the courage and dignity of those who, like Benga, were forced to endure this cruelty. Through this story, we will reflect on the lessons it holds for us today, lessons about empathy, justice, and the enduring importance of recognizing the humanity in everyone. As we walk through this history together, you will see how a single life, like that of Ota Benga, can illuminate the broader truths of a society grappling with prejudice and exploitation. You will also witness the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering, and why remembering these stories is essential, not just to acknowledge the past, but to build a more just and compassionate future. If you value stories that shed light on hidden chapters of history, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Your support helps us continue sharing important stories like Ota Benga's and ensures that these voices, too long silenced, are heard. Together, let us explore the untold histories that shape the world and remind ourselves why respect, empathy, and understanding must guide our actions today. This is the story of Ota Benga, a story of loss, resilience, and the enduring fight for human dignity. And it all begins here. As Ota Benga's story unfolded in the bustling streets of New York City, it became a stark reflection of a much larger, darker phenomenon that had gripped both Europe and the United States during the 19th and early 20th centuries: the widespread practice of human zoos. These exhibitions were not mere curiosities or harmless entertainments. They were deeply entwined with the prevailing social and scientific ideologies of the time, ideologies that sought to justify domination, exploitation, and the subjugation of entire peoples. Across continents, non-European individuals were removed from their homelands under the pretense of education and display, often subjected to conditions that reduced them to objects of spectacle. Their cultures trivialized, their humanity questioned. The justification for such practices was rooted in pseudoscientific beliefs that created a hierarchy among humans, with white Europeans at the pinnacle and darker-skinned peoples at the base, considered primitive and in need of guidance. These distorted ideas of human value, dressed as academic and scientific reasoning, provided a veneer of legitimacy for acts that were nothing short of dehumanization, allowing entire societies to view the exploitation of other human beings as a normal, even necessary, Part of progress? The human zoo phenomenon was both a product and a reinforcement of the colonial mindset that had swept across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. European powers, driven by economic ambitions and a sense of cultural superiority, colonized vast territories, extracting resources and imposing systems of governance that disrupted local societies. Within this context, human zoos became an extension of colonial domination, a stage upon which the world could observe and marvel at the other in a way that reinforced prevailing prejudices. Visitors to these exhibitions, often families and children eager for spectacle, were shown people from distant lands living in mock villages, engaging in what were portrayed as primitive customs. Their appearances, clothing, and rituals scrutinized, photographed, and sometimes manipulated to fit preconceived notions of savagery. The message was clear. These individuals were fundamentally different, less civilized, and therefore subject to the authority and oversight of the white, so-called enlightened observer. The pseudoscience underpinning these displays was pervasive and influential, drawing upon concepts like social Darwinism, which misapplied evolutionary theory to human societies, suggesting that some races were inherently superior to others. Scholars and scientists of the era often lent credibility to these views, publishing studies and pronouncements that categorized human beings into rigid hierarchies based on skin color, facial features, and other physical traits. This distorted science did more than provide academic validation. It seeped into popular culture, influencing media, education, and public policy. It shaped perceptions in ways that justified slavery, segregation, and the systematic marginalization of black and indigenous populations, creating a social environment in which the extraordinary indignity suffered by people like Ota Benga could occur without widespread outrage. In classrooms and lecture halls, children learned about the supposed inferiority of certain peoples, while in fairs and exhibitions, the same children might gape at live human displays, internalizing the message that these individuals were curiosities rather than equals. Human zoos were particularly prominent at international exhibitions and world fairs, where they were packaged as educational attractions intended to showcase the diversity of the human race. The 1889 World Fair in Paris, for example, introduced thousands of visitors to the Negro village, a display of African individuals captured or coerced from their homelands, living under constant scrutiny and often performing tasks or rituals dictated by the organizers. In the United States, the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair expanded upon this model with the Savage Olympics, compelling people from Africa and other regions to engage in cultural demonstrations for the entertainment of hundreds of thousands of fairgoers. These exhibitions reinforced the idea that non-European people existed primarily for observation, that their lives, stories, and traditions could be appropriated and commodified for profit and spectacle. Through these displays, the visitor's gaze became a tool of social control, normalizing racial hierarchies and cementing the notion that white civilization was the standard against which all others should be measured. Within this historical framework, the individual tragedies of those placed in human zoos gain even greater resonance. Ota Benga's ordeal was not an isolated event but part of a systemic pattern in which entire communities were dehumanized, their lives treated as entertainment and their identities distorted to fit narratives of inferiority. The mechanisms of exploitation were often elaborate, involving intermediaries who profited from the kidnapping and transport of individuals, as well as institutions like museums and zoological societies that lent authority to the practice. What made these human zoos particularly cruel was the way they combined spectacle with supposed science, creating a scenario in which the humiliation of the human being on display was framed as both educational and natural. Visitors might marvel at the customs of another culture, while failing to recognize the suffering and displacement inherent in forcing those individuals into cages and staged environments far from their homes. Yet beyond the exhibitions and the crowds, there were personal stories, lives interrupted and reshaped by this system. People like Ota Benga carried the weight of loss, displacement, and isolation, navigating the tension between curiosity and cruelty, fascination and exploitation. The displays stripped them of autonomy, reduced their identities to caricatures, and exposed them to constant public scrutiny. At the same time, these exhibitions influenced society's broader perception of race, embedding false notions of inferiority into law, policy, and cultural understanding. The legacy of these human zoos extended far beyond the walls of the exhibition, shaping social hierarchies, reinforcing discriminatory practices, and leaving psychological scars on those who survived them. In exploring the history of human zoos, it becomes clear that they were not mere oddities of the past, but manifestations of a worldview that intertwined science, spectacle, and systemic oppression. A worldview that allowed ordinary people to accept the extraordinary injustice of human beings treated as objects. The story of Ota Benga, placed in a cage labeled a missing link, is both emblematic and deeply personal, a lens through which we can understand the broader societal forces that enabled such exploitation, and a reminder of the enduring need to critically examine the ways in which knowledge, power, and prejudice intersect. As the story of human zoos unfolded across Europe and America, the figure of Ota Benga became emblematic not only of the systemic injustices of the era, but also of the individuals who directly profited from and perpetuated his suffering. Among them were Samuel P. Verner, a self-styled explorer and missionary from South Carolina, and William Hornaday, the director of the Bronx Zoo, both of whom played pivotal roles in turning Benga's life into a public spectacle. Verner's involvement in Benga's story began far from the bustling streets of New York, in the dense forests of the Congo, where he journeyed under the guise of religious and scientific work, claiming to bring civilization and education to the peoples he encountered. Verner operated in a shadowy space where moral pretense masked the brutal realities of exploitation. He arranged the removal of individuals from their homes, negotiating with traffickers and local intermediaries, and transported them thousands of miles to exhibitions where their lives would be scrutinized, judged, and commodified for the entertainment of foreign audiences. The veneer of missionary work gave Verner a measure of social legitimacy, allowing him to operate with little public scrutiny, even as the lives of those he took were irrevocably altered. Once in America, the orchestration of Benga's public display fell under the supervision of William Hornaday, a man celebrated for his contributions to zoology, but whose understanding of human dignity was tragically limited by the prevailing racial ideologies of the time. Hornaday recognized that visitors to the zoo were drawn as much to humans as to animals, and he exploited this curiosity without hesitation, creating an exhibit in which Benga, once a free man, became the centerpiece of attention, a living display under the sign Missing Link. The exhibition itself was framed as an ethnological and educational endeavor, a claim that masked the cruelty of confining a man in a cage and presenting him as a biological curiosity rather than a person. Hornaday's justifications echoed the wider pseudoscientific beliefs of the period, which had long depicted non-European peoples as closer to animals than humans. Yet these claims failed to mitigate the real suffering experienced by Benga, whose eyes, expressions, and gestures were constantly under observation, commented upon, and sensationalized. The public's response to Benga's presence in the Bronx Zoo was immediate and intense. Visitors crowded the primate house, their attention riveted not on the orangutans or other animals, but on the man whose life had been uprooted and placed on display. Newspapers of the time eagerly covered Benga's appearance, amplifying his notoriety and often emphasizing aspects of his body or culture in ways that highlighted exoticism over humanity. Accounts focused on details such as his ritualized teeth, his movements, and even his ability to interact with the orangutans, framing these characteristics as curiosities to be gawked at rather than facets of a complex, intelligent individual. Sensational headlines, widely circulated across the country, treated Benga's life as entertainment, reducing the narrative of a man who had endured profound personal loss and trauma to a series of amusing or shocking anecdotes for the amusement of readers. The media frenzy reinforced the spectacle, drawing thousands more visitors to the zoo and magnifying the reach of his exploitation. Benga's experience illustrates the interplay between personal ambition and systemic oppression. Werner and Hornaday, operating in different spheres but with aligned interests, transformed Benga's life into a commodity, each motivated by a combination of profit, prestige, and societal validation. Their actions were not anomalies but rather reflections of an era in which racial hierarchies and pseudoscientific authority legitimized the dehumanization of entire communities within the crowded hallways of the world's fairs and zoos. Benga's individuality was ignored, his personhood overridden by the narrative crafted for spectators eager to see the exotic other. Yet, even amidst the crowds, the flashing cameras, and the written accounts that reduced him to an attraction, traces of Benga's humanity persisted. The intelligence in his eyes, the subtle expressions that conveyed discomfort or curiosity, and the silent defiance of a man who had already endured the unimaginable. The exploitation of Benga also sheds light on the broader cultural and ethical failures of the institutions involved. Museums and zoological societies, often heralded as centers of learning and conservation, became complicit in practices that normalized the observation and control of human beings for public display. By framing these exhibitions as educational or scientific, figures like Hornaday and Werner obscured the profound moral violations inherent in their actions, blurring the lines between study and spectacle, research and entertainment. In doing, they reinforced societal prejudices and created enduring myths about racial difference, leaving a legacy that would influence public perception for decades. Their treatment of Benga, while applauded by some contemporaries, represents a chilling example of how authority and prestige can be wielded to justify acts of profound cruelty. Amidst the crowds and media frenzy, Benga's own voice and agency were nearly erased. His thoughts, feelings, and perspectives were filtered through the interpretations of others, with reporters, curators, and promoters dictating how the world perceived him. The headlines and stories often misrepresented his reactions, attributing amusement or contentment where there was fear, sorrow, or resistance, crafting a narrative that fit comfortably within societal expectations of the time, rather than reflecting the truth of his lived experience. Even attempts to advocate on his behalf were often constrained by these structures of power, highlighting how individuals who sought justice or humane treatment had to navigate both social prejudice and institutional complicity. In recounting the story of Ota Benga, it becomes clear that his life in captivity at the hands of Werner and Hornaday was more than a personal tragedy. It was a window into a historical system that commodified human lives for spectacle, profit, and the reinforcement of discriminatory ideologies. His experiences illuminate the ways in which individuals and institutions colluded, consciously or unconsciously, to perpetuate harm, creating a cautionary tale about the ethical responsibilities that accompany authority and the devastating human cost when those responsibilities are ignored. Through this lens, Benga is not merely a victim of circumstance but a symbol of the countless lives overshadowed by exploitation, whose stories demand acknowledgement, reflection, and remembrance, providing a vital context for understanding the enduring impact of historical injustices on society. As Ota Benga's presence in the Bronx Zoo drew ever larger crowds and the glare of public attention intensified, the moral and social consequences of his exhibition could no longer be ignored. Though many were initially unwilling to confront them, Among the voices that rose in protest was Reverend James Gordon, a prominent African-American clergyman whose reputation for eloquence and advocacy lent weight to a challenge that was both urgent and deeply personal. For Gordon and his contemporaries, Benga's treatment was not merely an isolated indignity inflicted upon one man. It was emblematic of the broader racial oppression that permeated every aspect of American society. A vivid, painful illustration of how African-American humanity was frequently dismissed or trivialized. As he traveled to the zoo and confronted the sight of Benga confined in the primate house, mingling under a sign that dehumanized him as a missing link, Gordon's outrage was compounded by the understanding that such exhibitions served to reinforce social hierarchies, to signal to the wider public that black lives were somehow less valuable, less fully human, and perpetually subject to surveillance and control. Gordon's protest was a careful balance of moral authority and strategic advocacy. He recognized that challenging the exhibit required more than mere indignation. It demanded eloquence, persistence, and the ability to appeal to both conscience and reason in a society conditioned to accept racial hierarchies as natural. His letters and public statements emphasized the profound psychological and spiritual harm inflicted upon Benga, articulating that such treatment was a violation of the most basic principles of human dignity and community respect. He drew attention to the absurdity of a society that allowed a man to be caged and gawked at, while simultaneously upholding laws and social norms that limited the rights and opportunities of Black Americans. By framing Benga's suffering within the broader context of systemic injustice, Gordon transformed an individual story into a rallying point, one that demanded recognition of the humanity of African Americans at a time when such recognition was neither widespread nor universally accepted. Yet Gordon's interventions were met with resistance from multiple fronts. Within the media, many editors and journalists struggled to reconcile the moral urgency of the protest with their own perceptions, biases, or the commercial incentive to sensationalize Benga's appearance. Newspapers that had previously celebrated the novelty and curiosity of the exhibition were slow to acknowledge the ethical implications, some dismissing the protest as overblown or inconsequential. Even within civic and governmental authorities, the power structures that controlled public spaces were hesitant to act. Caught between deference to established figures such as William Hornaday and the pressure of growing public scrutiny, this reluctance highlighted the systemic nature of the problem. The dehumanization of Benga was not simply a matter of individual cruelty, but the product of social, institutional, and cultural forces that collectively enabled his exploitation. Gordon's advocacy thus took on the character of a sustained campaign, one that sought to shift public perception, challenge institutional complicity, and demand accountability in the face of entrenched resistance. In his engagements with both the public and the authorities, Gordon also emphasized the symbolic weight of Benga's display. He argued that it was not only a matter of personal indignity for one man, but a visible confirmation to all African Americans that their humanity could be subordinated for entertainment or profit. The psychological impact on Black communities, he contended, was profound, sending messages that extended far beyond the zoo's walls into everyday life, reinforcing a society in which racial prejudice was codified in law, normalized in education, and celebrated in culture. By linking Benga's plight to broader social inequities, Gordon framed the conversation in terms that could resonate with multiple audiences, urging white Americans to recognize that the moral failing was collective, not simply the responsibility of a few individuals. His efforts were not abstract or rhetorical. They were grounded in lived experience and a keen awareness of the social stakes, reflecting the broader struggle for civil rights and dignity that African American leaders had waged across generations. As news of the protests and the growing public debate reached wider audiences, Benga's story transformed from a curiosity into a flashpoint for national reflection on race, ethics, and justice. Editorials, letters to the editor, and public commentary began to reflect the moral urgency highlighted by Gordon and his allies, revealing cracks in the initially unyielding support for the exhibition. Though not immediate, this shift in attention laid the groundwork for eventual intervention, illustrating how persistent advocacy could challenge entrenched institutional practices, even in an era dominated by pseudoscientific racial hierarchies and societal indifference. Gordon's campaign demonstrated the power of moral clarity and the necessity of raising public consciousness, showing that individual action, when grounded in justice and amplified through strategic engagement, could create the conditions for meaningful change. At the heart of this struggle was the recognition of Benga's inherent humanity, a truth that his captors and the early spectators often overlooked or refused to acknowledge. Gordon's protest served as a reminder that while systemic structures might facilitate oppression, individual voices could insist upon dignity and demand ethical accountability. By insisting that Benga be seen as fully human, capable of feeling, suffering, and deserving of respect, Gordon and like-minded advocates challenged both the spectacle and the ideologies that sustained it. Their interventions illuminated the moral stakes of a society grappling with the legacies of slavery, colonization, and racial discrimination, highlighting that acts of courage and advocacy could resonate beyond a single case, influencing public conscience and shaping the evolving discourse on human rights. Through Reverend James Gordon's persistent efforts, Ota Benga's story became not only a narrative of suffering and exploitation, but also a lens through which the broader African American community, and society at large, could confront the ethical failings of their institutions and themselves, understanding that the fight for justice and recognition required vigilance, moral courage, and the determination to elevate humanity above spectacle. After the intense public scrutiny and the moral outrage sparked by Reverend James Gordon and other advocates, Ota Benga was finally removed from the confines of the primate house at the Bronx Zoo. But his journey toward safety and dignity was far from over. He was initially placed in the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum in Brooklyn, a space, though foreign and structured by unfamiliar customs, provided a measure of protection and community absent from his previous existence in captivity. Within the walls of the orphanage, Benga encountered children who were curious, wide-eyed, and eager to learn, and he, in turn, became a source of fascination and instruction, sharing knowledge that was at once practical, cultural, and deeply rooted in his heritage. He taught them skills that connected them to the natural world: how to hunt small animals, track movements in the forest, fashion bows from vines, and observe the rhythms of wildlife, instilling in them a sense of ingenuity and survival that transcended the ordinary lessons of the classroom. Yet, amidst these moments of connection, the shadow of his past loomed large, and no amount of instruction, praise, or community could erase the trauma of a man forcibly torn from his home, his people, and the life he had known. The transition to the Lynchburg Theological Seminary in Virginia marked a new chapter in Benga's life, one that offered both opportunities for personal growth and the persistent ache of loss. The seminary, distinguished by its all-black faculty and liberal arts curriculum, provided a level of intellectual engagement that was rare for African Americans of the time, challenging the narrow educational expectations imposed by white patrons who often limited black students to vocational or industrial training. Here, Benga's role evolved into that of both learner and teacher, absorbing lessons in theology, ethics, and cultural history while simultaneously sharing the stories, practices, and rituals of his own people. The children in the surrounding community, often barefoot and curious, were drawn to his presence, following him on excursions into the woods where he would recount tales of hunting elephants, celebrate the small victories of capturing game, and chant ritual songs that preserved the memory of a homeland now physically and irreversibly distant. In these moments, Benga became a bridge between worlds, linking the experiences of the African forest with the realities of a segregated American city, allowing the young listeners to glimpse a perspective far removed from the constraints of their everyday lives. Despite these enriching interactions and the care of supportive figures such as Mary Hayes Allen, who took him into her home and treated him as part of her extended family, Benga's internal struggle remained profound and unrelenting. The joy of teaching and sharing his cultural heritage was persistently shadowed by the deep melancholy of exile and loss, and many who observed him noted the gradual intensification of his sadness. He would often sit alone for hours beneath the trees, eyes fixed on some distant point as if searching for a landscape that no longer existed, and his song, once vibrant and celebratory, began to carry a tone of longing and sorrow. Memories of his wife and children, slaughtered during the violent incursions of colonial militias in the Congo, haunted his nights, and the knowledge that he would never return to his homeland grew heavier with each passing year. Even amidst the laughter and energy of the neighborhood children, Benga's gaze sometimes seemed distant, his spirit weighed down by the irreversible separation from a life that had been cruelly taken from him. The community around Benga witnessed both the vitality and the fragility of his existence. They marveled at his skills and storytelling, captivated by the authenticity and depth of his knowledge. Yet they were increasingly aware of his moments of profound solitude, when the world he had once inhabited became palpable only in memory. He maintained rituals of remembrance, building small fires in the fields and moving in deliberate, almost ceremonial patterns, singing chants and engaging in gestures that carried the weight of ancestral memory. These practices, though simple to the casual observer, were imbued with layers of meaning. They were acts of survival, of cultural preservation, and of personal mourning, allowing Benga to assert his identity in a society that had repeatedly denied him the recognition of his humanity. The duality of his life at the seminary, both a teacher, a cultural emissary, and a man haunted by loss, underscored the complexity of his experience in America. He existed in a liminal space between worlds, never fully at home in the foreign institutions that sheltered him, yet able to transmit the richness of his heritage to a new generation. The children under his guidance learned not only the skills of the forest and the stories of a distant land, but also witnessed the resilience of a man whose life had been violently disrupted, yet who continued to contribute meaningfully to his community. In this way, Benga's presence became both a testament to the enduring power of human dignity and a poignant reminder of the costs of cultural exploitation and forced displacement. Even as he carved out this new life, the ever-present longing for family and homeland shaped his interactions, his moods, and his sense of purpose. It was a tension between connection and isolation, between the embrace of community and the persistent ache of exile, that defined the final years of his life, while he cultivated relationships, taught, and shared the essence of his cultural knowledge. The unresolved grief of loss and separation remained a constant companion, illustrating that even in the midst of safety and care, the wounds inflicted by violence and injustice could not be fully erased. Benga's story in the Howard-colored orphan asylum and at the Lynchburg Theological Seminary thus stands as a complex portrait of survival, cultural transmission, and enduring sorrow, highlighting both the capacity for human resilience and the indelible marks left by displacement, exploitation, and the loss of one's roots. Ota Benga's life, marked by extraordinary resilience yet profound suffering, reached its tragic conclusion on the 19th of March, 1916, when he took his own life in Lynchburg, Virginia. The act was a devastating reflection of the cumulative trauma he had endured: decades of violence, displacement, and dehumanization that no amount of kindness or care could entirely heal. Benga had survived the violent raids on his village, the loss of his wife and children, the brutal commodification of his identity in human zoos, and the daily psychological burden of being seen as less than human by a society enthralled with racial hierarchy. Yet even in environments designed to nurture him, such as the Howard-colored orphan asylum and the Lynchburg Theological Seminary, the ghosts of his past haunted him relentlessly. A constant reminder of a home he would never return to and a family he could never see again. His death was not only a personal tragedy, but a poignant symbol of the destructive consequences of systemic racism and cultural exploitation, illustrating how historical injustices can reverberate across a person's life, leaving scars invisible to the wider world. Despite the sorrow surrounding his passing, Benga's story did not fade into obscurity. Over the decades, scholars, historians, and activists began to examine his life as a lens through which to explore the broader implications of colonialism, racism, and human exploitation. His experience in the 1904 Louis World's Fair and the Bronx Zoo became central case studies in understanding the pseudoscientific rationalizations that justified human zoos and the ways in which these exhibitions reinforced societal hierarchies. Academic research has explored not only the historical facts of his captivity, but also the psychological and cultural dimensions of his ordeal, examining how individuals like Benga navigated life in societies that systematically devalued their existence. Through these studies, Benga's story has become a critical reference point in discussions about the ethics of representation, the legacies of colonial violence, and the enduring impact of racialized scientific discourse. In addition to scholarly attention, Benga's life has inspired a range of cultural works, from literature to film, allowing wider audiences to engage with his story and to grapple with the complex issues it raises. Books, documentaries, and creative interpretations have explored both the factual and emotional dimensions of his experiences, highlighting the ways in which individuals can bear witness to history through art and storytelling. His life has been evoked in narratives that emphasize resilience, identity, and the human capacity to endure, even under conditions of extreme adversity. These works serve not only to memorialize Benga, but also to educate new generations about the injustices that were perpetrated in the name of entertainment, science, and social hierarchy, ensuring that his experiences continue to resonate in contemporary conversations about human rights and dignity. Recognition of Benga's historical significance culminated in the installation of a historic marker in Lynchburg in 2017, nearly a century after his death. This acknowledgement represents more than a symbolic gesture. It is an affirmation that the suffering and resilience of individuals like Benga must be remembered, that the historical record should not omit the voices of those who endured the cruelties of racism and exploitation. The marker serves as a site of reflection and education, inviting residents and visitors to confront the past honestly and to consider the ongoing implications of racial injustice. It is a reminder that history is not merely a chronicle of events, but a living conversation about values, ethics, and collective responsibility. Benga's legacy also extends into contemporary discourse on racial justice and human dignity. His story challenges us to examine the societal structures that allowed such dehumanization to occur and to consider the ways in which similar attitudes, though perhaps less overt, persist in various forms today. By remembering Benga, we honor the humanity that was denied him in life and recognize the importance of advocacy, empathy, and moral courage in confronting injustice. His experiences underscore the necessity of creating a society that values every individual, regardless of race, background, or cultural heritage, and the profound consequences when this principle is ignored. As we reflect on Ota Benga's extraordinary life and hear the echoes of his suffering and resilience, we are reminded of the responsibility to ensure that such injustices are neither forgotten nor repeated. His journey from a village in the Congo to the exhibits of human zoos, through moments of care and education, and ultimately to a tragic end, tells a story that is both deeply personal and widely instructive. It is a narrative that calls on us to recognize the humanity in one another, to challenge systems of oppression wherever they exist, and to honor those whose lives were irrevocably shaped by cruelty and indifference. Thank you for taking the time to learn about the life of Ota Benga, to bear witness to his story, and to reflect on the lessons it offers for justice, empathy, and historical awareness. If you found this video meaningful and want to support the channel's efforts to shed light on forgotten histories and important narratives, please make sure to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others. Your engagement helps ensure that stories like Benga's continue to be told, remembered, and honored, inspiring reflection and action for generations to come.